When was the last time you just stopped? Put down your devices, ignored your notifications, and just spent a moment being still, being present, thoughtful, and reflective. In today's busy, noisy, distracting, and non-stop world, it's hard to be still. But history's greatest thinkers and leaders have recognized that stillness is a secret weapon. Stillness brings you moments of great clarity and creativity, helps you triumph over your tempers, and creates the space to appreciate and rejoice in the pleasure of life. I'm Marston York, a narrator at Blinkist, and in these blinks to stillness is the key, I'm going to show you that stillness is not about inactivity. It's about powerful moments that can change your life. Anybody can learn to be still, even while the world spins around you. Rome isn't known for being a quiet city. It's enormous, crowded, and often chaotic. Ancient Rome was no different. And in the 1st century AD, Lucius Annaeus Seneca lived right in the thick of it. His busy street had a steady, cacophonous stream of barking dogs, carriages rumbling over cobblestones, and carpenters hammering away in their shops. At the same time, Seneca was a well-known and influential figure, quite the polymath actually. He was a powerful broker, the city's greatest living playwright, and a highly respected philosopher. But this wasn't a good year for him. His finances were a mess. His political enemies had pushed him out of power, and, most worryingly, he was starting to lose favour with the emperor Nero, who had a habit of decapitating people on a whim. Seneca really needed to get important work done to regain influence and control. After all, he had a reputation to uphold and a head to keep. If only people outside weren't so loud. But somehow, despite the absolute din outside and the mess of his personal affairs, Seneca managed to tune it all out. He could dive into a deeply focused state and access his full capacities. In that very room, he wrote beautifully crafted essays that have been read by millions, are still widely studied today, and contain timeless truths. We nowadays can learn a lot from Seneca. After all, our times are even noisier. To the chatter and clatter of Seneca's environment, we can add car horns and planes overhead, and we've got the added mental weight of overflowing inboxes and a constant stream of social media notifications. So, what was his secret? Well, Seneca was able to find peace among the noise by embracing stillness. It may seem abstract, but you know stillness when you experience it. If you've ever concentrated so deeply that a burst of insight strikes you, you know stillness. If you've ever stepped in front of an audience and poured months of practice into a single powerful performance, that's stillness. If you've ever watched the slow rise of the morning sun and felt warmth at the simple phenomenon of being alive, you've felt stillness. Seneca lived thousands of years ago, but the power of stillness abides. And it's not just a concept that falls under Stoicism, Seneca's guiding philosophy. Around the world and across the ages, philosophers and religions have embraced it, calling it many names. The Buddhists talked of upekkha, Muslims aslama, Christians equanimitas, and in plain English, stillness. Seneca believed that stillness is the key to peace, clarity, and happiness. And if people could find peace within themselves, they would still be able to think, work, and be well, even if the world around them was at war. There's a powerful example of this many centuries after Seneca lived. On October the 15th, 1962, John F. Kennedy woke up to a dramatically changed world. While he'd been sleeping, the The CIA had identified Soviet nuclear missile sites being constructed in Cuba just 90 miles off the US coast. Suddenly, the United States was threatened with the possibility of nuclear attack. And Kennedy felt the heat. Nobody quite knew how many people would die in the first few nuclear attacks, but it would, at minimum, be millions. The advice from his advisors was clear and totally instinctual. Aggression must be met with greater aggression, so the missile sites had to be destroyed. The problem was that if this approach failed, it would trigger a catastrophic nuclear war with nobody left to bear witness to the mistake. The 13 days that followed have come to be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. And despite all that was at stake, Kennedy was able to bear the immense weight on his shoulders. And how was he able to think clearly and navigate the crisis successfully? First, Kennedy slowed things down. Instead of rushing into a decision, he stayed reflective. His handwritten notes from the time are evidence of a kind of meditative process at work. On page after page he wrote missile, 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 or leaders, leaders, leaders. On one pad he drew 2 sailboats calmly sailing. Without the time to sail himself, Kennedy instead swam in the White House pool to give himself space to think. He also sought peace and solitude in the Rose Garden. Later, he even thanked the resident gardener for her contribution to solving the crisis. Eventually, he announced a blockade of Cuba. This less aggressive option didn't resolve the crisis, but Kennedy had decided that a swift outcome was less important than making sure his opposite number, Soviet President Nikita Khrushchev, also had time and space to think. It bought them both time to carefully consider the weight of their options. And think Khrushchev did. 11 days after the crisis began, the Soviet leader wrote to Kennedy. "If leaders do not display statesmanlike wisdom," he wrote, "they will clash, bringing mutual annihilation." The crisis was over, and negotiations over the removal of missiles began. Kennedy had helped pull the world back from a global cataclysm. Not through a chest-beating show of strength or the threat of aggression, but through finding the time and space, the stillness, to think his options through and choose the wisest course. One way of finding stillness involves limiting the inputs of your life so that you can be as present as possible. In 2010, at New York's Museum of Modern Art, the artist Marina Abramovic did just that, and turned presence into a feat of endurance. For 750 hours across 79 days, she sat, still and silent and fully present in each moment. She shared her stillness with the more than 1,500 strangers who came to visit her, doing nothing more than looking at her visitors in the eyes. Hour after hour, day after day, people came. Each time she took a moment to look down, collected herself, and then looked at her new visitor. She knew that it would instantly be clear to the person opposite her if she started daydreaming or exhibited fatigue or boredom, and so she focused solely on the present moment. Visitors who sat across from Abramovic found the experience powerful. Some cried because it's so rare simply to experience another person so fully and completely present. That's because today we're mostly trying to get out of the moment. Instead of simply enjoying a beautiful sunset, we take a photo of it. Or if we ever have a quiet evening at home, our minds race through lists of things that need doing. Standing in line to see Marina Abramovic, we check our phones. It's no wonder that we struggle to be present when we're constantly bombarded by information. We feel an urgent need to stay on top of that information, reading every email, checking the news multiple times a day, and seeing real-time updates from our friends' lives on social media. What we should do instead is take a life lesson from Napoleon. The great general deliberately delayed responding to correspondence. His secretary was told to wait 3 full weeks before opening any letter. When he finally heard what had been written, Napoleon enjoyed noting how often the supposedly urgent issue had simply sorted itself out. That's not to say Napoleon was negligent, far from it, but he had the wisdom to select and limit his inputs. His messengers were told never to rouse him from sleep with good news, which could wait. But bad news required an instant wake-up call. For then, Napoleon said, there's no time to lose. So build up some discipline. Use Do Not Disturb to block calls. Divert emails to subfolders. Unfriend toxic people who bring unnecessary drama to your life. Embrace a more philosophical, long-term perspective rather than following the world's events second by second. Block out the endless inputs, the noise of the world, and you'll find stillness. The art of journaling can also help you reflect deeply on your life and to think clearly. On June the 12th, 1942, Anne Frank wrote in her diary for the first time. She hoped she would be able to confide everything to the diary and that it would be a source of comfort to her. Just 24 hours later, Anne's family was forced into hiding from the Nazis. Anne continued to journal, a habit that continued to reward her with valuable insights even under the dire circumstances in which she and her family found themselves. She discovered that writing can be a way to watch yourself as if you were a stranger, giving you a fresh perspective on your actions. How noble everyone would be, she once wrote, if at the end of the day they reviewed their behaviour. Surely we would all try to do better the following day. Anne Frank wasn't the first to notice this either. Our Stoic philosopher friend Seneca, for example, wrote in his journal every night. He spared no detail and hid from no hard truth. After that, he said, he slept soundly. History is full of other notable journalers, including Oscar Wilde, Queen Victoria, Susan Sontag, and baseball all-star Shawn Green. And no wonder. There's clear evidence that journaling improves our well-being. Studies have shown that keeping a journal helps to restore well-being following traumatic events. A University of Arizona study found that people going through a divorce found it easier to move on if they recorded their experiences in a journal. So, to cut through the noise of daily life and focus on the most important reflections of the day, try picking up a pen and paper. And when you do, take Seneca's example and be sure to face up to any tough questions that arise. Why did I get so worked up about this today? Why do I care about impressing my co-workers? How did today's problems reveal my character? Honestly and thoughtfully facing up to these questions will make sure that you're getting the most out of journaling. What's the best way to get started? Well, the how, when, and where don't matter so much. What's really important is simply creating a quiet moment to get things off your chest, to find stillness through writing and reflection. Journal in the evening, in the morning, or for 5 minutes while sitting in the train. Whenever you can, really. It might be the most important time in your whole day. Life is noisy. Phones ring, notifications beep, and many of us wear headphones on a daily basis, blocking out unwanted noise with new noise. Sitting in an airplane with nowhere to go, you can see how much we rely on noise to avoid silence. We watch terrible movies or listen to podcasts rather than sit in silence and contemplate the terrain of our own thoughts. But why turn our minds over to distracting noise when we could instead take advantage of the great riches that silence offers us? Those riches are something that experimental music composer John Cage understood profoundly. Cage had always been fascinated by silence. In 1928, during a high school speaking competition, he even argued that the United States should establish a national day of quiet. It was the beginning of a life spent exploring what silence truly means. Cage's most famous creation, titled 4 minutes 33, is a composition with a twist. It's a 4-minute, 33-second long stretch of uninterrupted silence. During a pianist's first performance of the piece, the audience sat listening to the silence. During the first movement of the piece, they could hear the wind outside the hall. During the second, raindrops pattered on the roof. After the performance, Cage pointed out something important. Silence, he said, doesn't really exist. What we think of as silence isn't actually silent because it's full of accidental sounds. By giving people silence, Cage was helping them to start actually hearing. There's a lesson there for all of us whose lives are too noisy. Silence, or an absence of noise, can help us to refocus and to find clarity. To find stillness. Leadership expert Randall Stutman, who works with CEOs and Wall Street leaders, once studied how business big shots recharge during their time off. The key, he discovered, lay in spending time in environments with minimal noise, enjoying activities like long-distance cycling, swimming or scuba diving. There, these leaders recharged by escaping from the voices that cluttered their working lives. Dialing down the noise like this helps us to discover a deeper awareness of what's around us. That could mean simple awareness of the rain on the roof as a pianist sits silently at a piano. Or it could mean the answers to your business problems, which pop into your head during your 20th mile on the bike. People who can tap into stillness are able to achieve great feats, but stillness needs to be continually replenished and safeguarded. In June 2008, Tiger Woods won an 18-hole playoff to win the US Open Golf Championship for the third time. It was his 14th victory at a major, and some described it as one of the finest victories ever seen in the sport. And what's more, he did the whole thing with a leg that was broken in 2 places. It was the high point of Woods' career. But not long afterward, the golfer's world collapsed. For 21 days, the front pages of the New York Post detailed his affairs with porn stars and waitresses, as well as trysts in church parking lots and with the young daughters of family friends. His secret life exposed, Woods didn't win another major for over 10 years. As the Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh has said, while the surface of the ocean may seem still, underneath, there are currents. That was certainly the case for Tiger Woods, a man famous for his ability to find stillness in moments of stress, who was, in fact, at the mercy of powerful riptides lurking under the surface. That's no surprise once you understand how Tiger Woods was raised to be a champion. His father, recognizing that golf relies on an ability to keep a clear head, would taunt Woods as he tried to tee off, calling him a motherfucker or slinging racist abuse at moments of high concentration. His mother threatened to beat him if he ruined her reputation as a parent. In Woods' own words, he was raised to be a cold-blooded killer on the golf course. And it worked. His upbringing made him a great champion. But it also left him with a profoundly troubled soul which drove him to neglect and betray his family in pursuit of dishonest and ultimately dissatisfying affairs. Later, Woods reflected on this time in his life and realized that if you're lying all the time, life is no fun. Woods' story shows that the relentless pursuit of anything isn't worth it if we damage our souls in the process. As we've seen, stillness is handy for becoming more effective in business or in sports, but what's it all for if in our personal lives we're more like hot-blooded raging bulls than the serene monks we aim to be? Our happiness and our contentedness in life comes from achieving stillness of the soul. Learning to conquer desires and accepting that you have enough will preserve your ability to tap into stillness. Take a moment to reflect on how much you're driven by desire. Most of us fall prey to desire, whether for a beautiful person, power, the latest iPhone, or money. If we're overly driven by our desires, it becomes harder to achieve true contentedness. That's because superficial desires, as opposed to those that lead to more noble pursuits, usually come at a cost. The Greek philosopher Epicurus had a good test for distinguishing between the two. Anytime he felt himself being tugged by a new desire, he asked himself, how will I feel afterward if I actually get what I want? Asking yourself this question will help you focus on the hangover and not just the taste of the drink, on the sense of guilt and not just the thrill of the affair. Once you've learned to control your desires, it may be easier to take an important step toward finding stillness. Accepting that you have enough. The writers Kurt Vonnegut and Joseph Heller once attended a party at the palatial home of a billionaire. Vonnegut asked his friend how it felt to know that their host had probably earned more that same day than Heller's book Catch-22 had earned in its whole history. Heller replied that he had something the billionaire never would: the knowledge that he had enough. Heller meant that he was content with what he had achieved. This acceptance of enough can be a beautiful thing, bringing stillness in the form of release from want and comparison to others. So, if you find yourself lusting for more, remind yourself of Heller's contented embrace of enough. And know that after he said those words, Heller went on to produce 6 more novels. But he wasn't doing it to prove anything to himself or to anyone else. When a reporter critically commented that Heller hadn't written anything as good as his first work, Heller was able to reply with equanimity, "Who has?" Find stillness by bathing in beauty, which helps cleanse and calm you. On February the 23rd, 1944, Anne Frank climbed up to the attic space above the annex in which her family lived in hiding. She and Peter, a boy who lived with them and was also Jewish, sat at her favourite spot on the floor. They looked through a small window at the world from which they were shut away. Looking at a bright blue sky, the chestnut tree below them, and birds diving through the air, the two were entranced. Later, Anne would write in her diary that as long as sunshine and cloudless skies existed, she couldn't possibly be sad. Anne Frank wrote that even during misfortune, beauty remains. If you look for it, you can find happiness. It's no coincidence that the beauty sustaining Anne and Peter came from nature. When it comes to basking in the kind of true beauty that gives us peace and strength, there's no place quite like the natural world. There is a concept in Japan called Shinrin-yoku, or forest bathing. It's a kind of therapy that uses nature to heal spiritual woes, not unlike, as we talked about in an earlier blink, Kennedy finding stillness in the White House's Rose Garden during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Of course, it isn't always possible to take regular forest baths ourselves. Those of us who dwell in cities may have less inspiring immediate surroundings and can't always retreat to the wilderness in search of beauty. But if we can attune ourselves to less obvious manifestations of beauty, we begin to see it everywhere. That was the case for Roman philosopher and emperor Marcus Aurelius. Often seen as a dark and depressive Stoic, Marcus Aurelius wrote vividly of finding beauty in the ordinary. He talked of how bread splits as it bakes, and its cracks catch our eye and stir appetite within us. He even found beauty in death. We should, he wrote, come gracefully to our final resting place, falling as a ripened olive might, grateful to the tree that gave it life and growth. So no matter where you find yourself, take inspiration from Marcus Aurelius and Anne Frank and simply notice the beauty around you. The stillness that you find there may be a rarely appreciated phenomenon in most of our lives, but there is an inexhaustible supply of it in the world. You just need to take a moment to look. Physical activity is important for stillness, and cultivating a hobby is a good place to start. By anyone's standards, Winston Churchill's life was productive. By age 26, he'd been elected to the British Parliament. He would continue to serve in government over the course of 6.5 decades. As Britain's wartime Prime Minister, he helped defeat Nazism. He also wrote over 40 books and gave more than 2,000 speeches throughout his long and prolific life. Churchill might seem like the last person from whom we would expect stillness, but in fact, he possessed the quality in abundance. And his life was a prime example of one particular method for bringing peace and stillness to even the busiest life: taking care of yourself physically. Churchill's physical activity of choice was bricklaying, which was unusual to say the least. He learned from 2 of his employees at his Chartwell estate and soon fell in love with the meditative process of mixing mortar, troweling it on, and stacking up the bricks. In a 1927 letter to the then Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, Churchill wrote that he had enjoyed a delightful month. Alongside his duties as a minister, he had written 2,000 words a day and also laid 200 bricks. According to Churchill's daughter Mary, bricklaying and her father's other much-loved hobby, painting, were more than just pastimes. They were also his primary antidotes for the depression to which he was prone. Both activities allowed him an intellectual escape and, crucially, an opportunity to exercise his body. Cultivating mind and body can be a huge step toward becoming even a fraction as productive as Churchill, and a hobby is an ideal way to do so. That's why so many of the great figures in history were also hobbyists on the side. A generation before Churchill, 4-time Prime Minister of the United Kingdom William Gladstone took up chopping down trees. John Cage became a mushroom hunter, and the South American revolutionary Simón Bolívar danced. So, consider what physical activity might help release you from the pressures of your work or life, and allow you to find the stillness that Gladstone found in the thwack of an axe on oak, or that Churchill found in the slap of mortar on brick. But whatever you choose, you shouldn't take things too far, as we'll see in our final blink. Embracing sleep and moderation will help keep you at your best. Though Churchill discovered the joys of bricklaying at his own estate, it was in Cuba where he made arguably the most important discovery of his life. It wasn't a military strategy or a rhetorical device. No, it was the energy-giving powers of the siesta. Sure, taking care of ourselves physically means being active and finding ways to invigorate and enrich ourselves, but it's easy to focus too much on activity, as many of us do at work. It's all too common in our society to trade health for a few more hours in the office. "I'll sleep when I'm dead," say bankers, lawyers, and startup founders as they put in another grueling shift. But the true greats, the Winston Churchills of this world, know that no matter how active we are, we should never neglect the simple power of sleep. Sleep is something to be protected because it allows us to perform at our best. The psychologist Anders Ericsson studied master violinists and found that they slept a full 8.5 hours each night on average and napped most days. What's more, the greats napped more than lesser performers. There's more to this than just physiological benefits. Accepting that you need to stop working and get some sleep is fundamentally a question of knowing your limits. And this, the embrace of moderation, is another great route to stillness. Too many of us are simply trying to do too much. Prince Albert, husband to Britain's Queen Victoria in the 19th century, was a prime example. Prince Albert didn't just take his role as Prince Consort seriously, he took it too seriously, with an endless series of meetings and social obligations. He threw himself into organising the 1851 Great Exhibition, a 6-month-long celebration of the British Empire, and spent years of his life on the project. By the time it opened, he told his family that he felt more dead than alive. The event was a great success, but Albert's health never recovered from this overwork. When he died in 1861, his doctors believed that his constant overwork had seriously damaged his health. He had literally worked himself to death. Many of us today feel that there is always something to do. We tell ourselves that we need to reply to that email, that we have to join the last-minute out-of-state business trip. We don't. Stop. Be present. Know your limits. Embrace moderation. Protect the gift that is your body. Give attention to your physical health, to your spirit and your mind, and you can cultivate stillness. You can feel its power in your life. So slow things down. Calm things down. Quiet things down. Embrace stillness today. Thanks for listening to our blinks to Stillness is the Key by Ryan Holiday. I'm Marston York. Catch you next time.